I'm hoping everybody can participate in the discussion. It's intended to give you a solid understanding of your rights and the concepts and the nature of public lands in the United States and in New Jersey, especially the Pine Barrens. So why it's titled From No Man's Land to National Treasure is because we have this dueling conception of place that's been a competition now going on 100, 200 years of what this place we call the Pine Barrens is, what's it for, and this concept of public lands, and not just in New Jersey, but nationally. So we're going to dive into legal concepts, philosophical concepts, and practical concepts today. See if I can actually move my slides here. So we went over a little bit of the outline, and at the end we'll end with some of the threats and the opportunities and some of the victories that we've had recently. So big question: why do we even have public lands? What's the purpose? So for me, and these are going to be my top few reasons why, I really want to protect wildlife and natural resources. I want to have safe and inspiring places to go with my friends and my family. And I want to preserve that opportunity for exploration and curiosity that only big wild spaces really can do for me. Edward Abbey, if you haven't read Abbey, I'd really recommend at least Desert Solitaire. And this is a quote of his, that wilderness is not a luxury, but a necessity of the human spirit, and as vital to our lives as water and bread. A civilization which destroys what little remains of the wild, the spare, the original, is cutting itself off from its origins and betraying the principle of civilization itself. Abbey's great, yeah. So if you have a chance to read Desert Solitaire, I definitely recommend that. So about those big open spaces. So when you're talking about wildlife, there are some species of wildlife that really need large open space, and not just the larger animals like gray wolves or bison that you might think of, but also one of our native wildlife species, the northern pine snake. The average range for a northern pine snake population is about 3,500 acres. So you can see that's a big area around Batstow and Wharton State Forest, or almost all of lower Manhattan, going up into the West Village and over to Madison Square Garden. It's a big area. So if you start getting habitat fragmentation, where those pockets of the woods are getting smaller, species like northern pine snake and others start to lose ground, and they'll start suffering and really become eliminated. And that's why you don't see northern pine snake in every part of the Pine Barrens. You only see it where there's still big preserved patches of ground. Another thing I really value is having that shared story. So I've paddled the Batstow, the Mullica, the Grand Egg Harbor, and I can look back 100 years ago at pictures of people doing the same thing. So that really creates, some interesting ties and familiarities that kind of bind us together, having those shared stories. The explorations of the national parks, sharing stories of national parks and parks throughout the country that, we've gone to and enjoyed at different times, at different ages. This is just a nice picture of Goshen Pond in Wharton State Forest, showing part of the Mullica River. This is the pygmy pines. So if you haven't been to the pygmy pines out in Warren Grove, that's another little special spot of the Pine Barrens that you really should try to get out to if you haven't. Right now, there's no marked trail in the pygmy pines, and that's something I think we can change going forward. We really need to be able to get people out into these places to show why it's important to have them and to keep them for the long term, because as we'll see later, there will be pressures on places like the Pygmies, as there have been in the past. This is the Batona Trail, and I just want to give a shout out here to the Outdoor Club of South Jersey, because when I first started hiking on the Potomac, it was really in kind of rough shape. But since the Outdoor Club of South Jersey and the trail crew took over maintenance, it is really just night and day. It's been a big difference in how well the trail is maintained, how well it's marked, and even the routing has improved. So I just want to lay out. So okay, so I'm representing here mostly a European and New American conception of public land and land concepts, but there was, of course, preceding cultures that lived here, the Lenni Lenape, and they had different concepts and conceptions of land. So I just wanted to lay out this graphic to show that, you know, these ideas today, they were influenced by Lenni Lenape, but things were different, of course. So going back to the 30s, so these were the first, in the 30s, there were the first aerial images taken over New Jersey. And you can see land use was primarily, you can see the fields are the lighter color and the slightly darker gray, that's all woods. Today, it's pretty similar because of the success of the Pinelands Protection Act and the Pinelands Commission and the Comprehensive Management Plan. There's, of course, been a lot of development since 1935, but it's pretty amazing that things are somewhat similar to 100 years ago. This is a map of the distribution of federally held land, and you can see that most of it is heavily weighted to the west. Part of that is because much of the land in the east was already settled, but by the time the federal government was established. So federal lands are generally held in the west. So when we were making parks, when people made parks in New Jersey, they couldn't rely on just an act of Congress to designate, say, Wharton State Forest as a national park. It had to be a slower process of acquiring parcel by parcel from private owners. So it's a little bit easier to make a national park if all the land is already held by the federal government. But if you want to make a big park in a state like New Jersey or Pennsylvania, you're talking about acquiring private land from individual owners. And this is a distribution of public land in New Jersey. And you can see it's pretty heavily weighted to the south and to the north in the highlands. And of course, the biggest piece of green there is Wharton State Forest, right in the middle of South Jersey. So there's a few concepts going back to feudal Europe. So the public really didn't have much rights to land in feudal Europe. They could, do some grazing, do some farming, but really that was only at the behest of the lord of the manor. So they called the lands of the country the royal domain, and that term is actually held over in Canada, where if you go to Canada and you go into crown land, that's all held over, that concept that it's really the king or the queen's land, not the public's land. So that's a really core conceptual change that was made in the United States first. The idea of public land and not monarchical land. So it's a democratization of land and natural resources. So this is a little bit of an infographic, and the roots really even go back to Roman law. So res communes, which things that are common to all. These concepts from Roman law have been adapted into the public trust doctrine that was established into law in New Jersey in 2018. But there's a long thread connecting rights to land and resources. So here are some really specific ways to think about your rights on public land. So there's three different conceptions of rights. So usus rights, fructus rights, and abusus rights. So usus is you have a right to use. So maybe that's going hiking. Maybe that's going on a bike ride, a horseback ride, maybe canoeing or kayaking. Fructus rights, that would be the rights to pick the fruit, maybe cut wood. These are all rights that were heavily regulated in monarchical feudal Europe. So you couldn't go out on crown land, for instance, and just cut wood or take the fruits. That was all property of the lord. But today, you actually do have some rights to fruits. So just as an example, in Wharton State Forest, there still is a homeowner wood lot provision where they can designate a certain section of the state forest where people that heat with wood can go and actually cut downed or dead trees for firewood. So that's an example of fructus rights. Abusus rights would be something like, I'm going to take my bulldozer and heavily alter this landscape for whatever purpose it is, or even like an off-road vehicle gets into abusus rights. So that's something that we don't grant on public land, abusus rights, because it impacts the rights of everyone else. So if you go and bulldoze a wetland, now I can't go and enjoy that wetland, bulldoze a trail. So it's just a way to think about these rights to public property.
Jason, can I jump in with a question about the fructus rights?
Sure.
So
sure.
How, obviously, like everyone can't be taking all the wood. Like, how do they have limits on that? How do they decide who is taking that?
Yeah. So how that is determined really is a land manager decision, right? So the State Park Service, the superintendent of the state park, will manage that process as a replacement for the landlord, right? So we employ public land professionals to help us manage these places, and we rely on them to do their job. And if they're not, we have the right, of course, to petition our government to seek change.
Right. And could you touch on how the Green Amendment might speak to these rights?
Sure. So the Green Amendment, in time, if it's passed, could help us solidify that legal framework for maintaining the rights to clean air, clean water, and generally a healthy environment, which that just sustains the thread going back to Roman philosophy that we don't own these things, but we have rights to them. It's really all tied together. This is just another example of feudal land where there might be a small commons where villagers could go and graze sheep or chickens or their cows or whatnot. A bit of a holdover. So manorialism related to feudalism was still present even in the Pine Barrens in the late 1700s. So if you've been to Batstow Village, this is a picture of Batstow Village in Wharton State Forest. And Batstow was really a manorial town where you had essentially the Lord's house, the large mansion there, and you had villagers that went to work every day. They were given script. They could only shop in the store. They really had no rights to the land of the estate, but they were, of course, expected every day to wake up and do their jobs. So it was almost a feudal village in Batstow during the Iron Age. Which only lasted until about 1860, where the iron industry moved to Pennsylvania and other places with cheaper and more abundant sources of iron ore. The iron ore in the Pine Barrens, of course, was formed in the bog. So they actually had to go out into the wetlands and the bogs and take the sediment out that was then purified in the iron furnace. This is also centered on Batstow. So after the iron industry ended, there's no one thing you'll learn about the Pine Barrens is there's no shortage of schemes to exploit them or do something in the pines. So this was Joseph Wharton's scheme. He wanted to create a series of reservoirs to take the extremely abundant fresh water that we have here in South Jersey and direct it to Philadelphia as a source of drinking water. In the 1860s, 1870s, water coming out of the Schuylkill was very polluted, and I think it probably is still a little bit on that end today. But Joseph Wharton's idea, and he was a Philadelphia business entrepreneur, he thought he could export this water into Philadelphia as a source of clean drinking water for the city. The state got wind of this, the state legislature, and they prohibited the exportation of water. So that pretty much killed Joseph Wharton's plan. But the upside of that was that he had acquired all this land as to acquire the water rights. So his estate, which remained intact, about 96,000 acres up until the 1950s, served as the basis for the creation of Wharton State Forest. So while we didn't have that large amount of federal land, we did have some large private landowners that made it easier to create these parks. So this is another failed scheme that led to more and more preservation. So this was the concept of the Pinelands Jetport in New City. What they wanted to do was they thought the Pine Barrens would be a great place to make a new regional jetport, a supersonic jetport, and a new city based on, new philosophies of urban design. So they thought, wow, what a great place. It's totally open space. There's nobody there. We'll just take it over, make this new city, make a jetport, and be done with it. But that actually spurned the movement that created the Pinelands National Reserve. It served as a trigger moment that rallied people together, and the land that the new city and the jetport was on was actually acquired by the New Jersey Conservation Foundation, which has just been a really tremendous resource for New Jersey. They've preserved almost 125,000 acres of land, just that one nonprofit organization. And part of that was the West Plains of the pygmy pines, of that picture you saw earlier, where the jetport was proposed. Now it's part of a state wildlife management area. So Yosemite and Yellowstone were the first national parks, and I'm going to connect these two, but there's a great Ken Burns series and a great book called National Parks, America's Best Idea, and the author was Dayton Duncan, and Ken Burns made a documentary series based on that. And it's just all about the idea that we were the first to really say that, these beautiful places, these open spaces, it's not just for the rich and the connected, but they should be available to the public, the broad public, and that we all have rights to these places. Yellowstone was the first national park, and there's a really great book called How the U.S. Cavalry Saved Our National Parks. It's mostly about Yellowstone, because when Yellowstone was established in the 1870s, there were no provisions made for budgets, for employed land managers, for enforcement, for legal frameworks where you could actually prosecute poachers and other people, say, taking abuse rights. So the development of Yellowstone National Park closely mirrors the development of parks generally. So all the struggles that happened in the 1870s, some of which we're still dealing with today in the Pine Barrens, which is figuring out that legal framework, enforcement, and how we're actually going to protect the public rights to these lands. There is some philosophical divide in the national bureaucracy. So you have the National Park Service and the U.S. Forest Service, as well as the Bureau of Land Management. And these different agencies were started with different interests in mind. So the National Park Service was more about parks, public visitation, preservation of wildlife and wilderness. Whereas the Forest Service has a lot of that too, but also mining interests, logging interests, and more of a natural resource exploitation focus. But they both do a great job in their own way. But there's a lingering philosophical divide between those agencies. And there's a bit of the same divide in New Jersey, where you have the New Jersey State Park Service and the New Jersey Fish and Wildlife Service. The Park Service, again, more of that focus on public visitation, trails, paddling, canoeing, getting people out into those places, where Fish and Wildlife, more of a focus on hunting, fishing, some forestry. So the focus is just a little bit divided there.
Jason, with the land that is under the control of these two different services, how was it determined what would become a wildlife management area versus what would become a park for people to visit?
Well, there was no central planning really. It was what was available at the time and what agency was jumping on it at the time. I could say today, how it's determined is largely when you have a new piece of public land that's up for acquisition. Um, if it's closer to a wildlife management area, generally it goes to the wildlife management area. If it's closer to a state park, generally it goes to a state park. But it's not always totally the case, but it usually goes that way. And today, really, our state parks and wildlife management areas are so stressed for personnel. It's been a challenge actually getting them to say they want more land because they only have so much staff to support and manage that land. So that's something we'll need to look at in the future. But these are the basic tracks of federal tracks of public lands and wildlife management. So there is some federal land in the Pines, but mainly that's Forsyth Wildlife Refuge. We have a lot of county and municipal parks. One great one is Estelle Manor in Atlantic County. In Ocean County, there's some really nice parks like Caddis Island and Jake's Branch. But we have a ton of public land in the Pines, and we're really the better for it because we have ample opportunity to get outside and enjoy the place. And it also preserves that groundwater resource. This is just a bit of a timeline. And so the thing I like to point out is that the first wildlife regulation in New Jersey was actually for a bounty for killing wolves. So that was the first time there was actually a regulation, and it was actually to promote the elimination of wildlife. But you can see how our philosophy evolved since then. When, in 1862, they realized that the deer were really being wiped out. So they prohibited the hunting of deer for 5 years. And that actually happens again in the early 1900s. And then by 1934, they're actually reintroducing beaver because beaver had been trapped out. So there was a reawakening, a consciousness developed about the need to preserve wildlife and wild places. And it wasn't until 1955 that the Wharton estate, which was purchased by Joseph Wharton in the early 1870s, was acquired by the state. In the 20s, there was actually a referendum that failed. So it wasn't until 1955 that the bulk of the estate was purchased by Joseph Wharton's estate and became Wharton State Forest. The Green Acres Bill in 1961, that really formed the framework for the amount of public land we have today, because without that funding mechanism, there'd be no way to acquire all these large parcels that, especially today, cost millions of dollars. So the public in New Jersey has time and again funded the preservation of open space through open space referendums since the 1960s. And this is just a little quote by Governor Edward Stokes in 1905, and that was when the first concepts of creating state forests were enacted. So the first state forest was actually in Bass River, outside of New Gretna. So we had about 600 acres in Bass River that became what is today Bass River State Forest that was preserved. And it was an idea because they thought they were losing a lot of land to forest fires, because there was still a conception that forest fires were damaging at that time, where really it's really just a natural part of our ecosystem. But they viewed the forest fires as costing natural resources, timber resources. So that idea was to develop forest preserve, that they would learn actually how to prevent forest fire and how to essentially grow timber more readily in New Jersey for logging. This graphic shows the association of groundwater with public lands. So you can see the bulk of available groundwater resources. That's the map on your left. Is mostly where there's public land. Where you have public land, you have infiltration, and you don't have as much pumping. So they serve, especially in South Jersey, as underground reservoirs. And We call it the Kirkwood-Cohansey Aquifer, but essentially it's just sand where water is trapped beneath these layers of sand that are called the Kirkwood and Cohansey Formation. And without those infiltration points, we'd have too much pumping to refill and restore that aquifer. So without the public lands, the sources of groundwater in New Jersey really become compromised. In 1958, there was a Water Bond Act passed by referendum, and that provided for the establishment of water reservoirs in North Jersey, like Spruce Run and Round Valley. So that helped ensure that most of New Jersey would have access to fresh water, and it was to be done by creating these large public land areas that served as reservoirs. And you can say it's not cheap to make a reservoir. So even back then, it cost almost $50 million to make this huge, 11 billion gallon reservoir at Spruce Run Lake. So we will be seeing some impacts from global warming on public lands. And the big question I have is, how does that impact political pressure on our open space? Because as land is lost, developed land is lost, that'll create a political problem, because we are running out of space in New Jersey. Blue Acres acquisition, which is an offset of Green Acres, they're trying to acquire these flood-prone properties, but they can't make new land. So while we can acquire some of these properties that are no longer habitable or insurable, it doesn't solve the pressure on available land in the state. And then we also have water supply issues where the saltwater line is moving up, and then wells that formerly were fresh are now starting to see salt water intrude because of that sea level rise combined with pumping of the aquifer. So the more you pump, and especially if you're close to the coast, you might be seeing that salt start to move in and get into the groundwater. So the public trust doctrine, again, that's just the rights that we have to access the shoreline and tidal waters, but the philosophy really extends into the parks and open space as well. So these are just some of the milestones. So you had Arnold versus Mundy, which was the first public trust doctrine case that really solidified the principle of law, and then a few others that really helped to codify the doctrine into place in New Jersey. We need forest fire management in the Pine Barrens, mostly around developed areas. So controlled burns, and this is actually a picture of a hot prescribed burn in Franklin Park Reserve. These help protect the developed areas, but they also help maintain these natural systems, because we need fire in New Jersey in the Pine Barrens, because if you don't have wildfire, the canopy becomes closed, and rare species, say like Pine Barrens gentian, they no longer have the sunlight getting to the forest floor. So when a forest fire comes through, a year later, it's usually an abundant bloom of rare species like Pine Barrens gentian. So there's a concept called tragedy of the commons. So that's where you have a communal space that nobody's really looking after, nobody is claiming ownership of. So there's no central hierarchy determining what is allowed where. So that's one of the troubles that we have to deal with on public lands. So some of those impacts that we see are like illegal dumping, illegal offered vehicle use, in some areas off aquifer depletion, and sometimes you see diversions or encroachments. So if you go back to thinking about those abusus rights, clearly driving monster trucks in public lands and wetlands is damaging to that space. So that's an example of abusus rights being taken. Illegal dumping, where people say, well, the dump's too far, it's too expensive, I'll just dump it I'll just dump it on Wharton State Forest or in a park, another park. That's another example of abusus rights where they do have a right to the space, but not to damage it. Luckily, there's a lot of people that care a lot, and we're able to organize these cleanups and pick up some of this stuff that often gets dumped out in the Pine Barrens. But it's a big management problem. It's something that can be solved. It's just we need land managers to be more empowered. So this is some before and afters of off-road vehicle damage. So you can see on the left, but all three of these are in Wharton State Forest. These are places where those off-road vehicles would go in, drive around, do donuts, damage the landscape. But if you give it time, generally, and keep the vehicles off, they can be restored naturally. This also is in Wharton. So this is a picture of Penn Swamp Branch along Quaker Bridge, Penn Swamp Road. And this was a cut just south of the arrow. You can see a cleared space. That was a cut that was done in the late 1980s, forestry cut. And it was protested as Atlantic white cedar at the time, but it was allowed to happen. And the impact, I'll show you the impact. So the red line here indicates where there was a deer fence installed. So this was all cedar, but to the south of the line, just below the line, it all regenerated as cedar after it was clear cut. To the north of the line, it regenerated as pine and blueberries and a few other species. And the reason is because deer eat young cedar. So without a deer fence, there would be no restoration really possible. So you see the impacts are it's whenever we mess around with nature, we have to consider a lot of unintended impacts. So deer browse is one that, especially in forestry projects, really has to be carefully considered.
Also, Jason, since deer are a natural phenomenon, how have we changed that aspect of it? Like, humans haven't been around forever to be able to keep the deer away. So how did these trees get established in the first place?
Yeah, so while deer haven't been around forever, their populations may not be as high as they are now because we've made this edge habitat. Now, obviously, the deer hunting was also banned in 1900 because deer were wiped out by people hunting without any kind of regulation. So, yeah, it's complicated, I guess. So we've had some recent victories for public land as well. In Egg Harbor City, we stopped the giveaway of Egg Harbor City Lake Park to a warehouse and retail development. We stopped at the planning board a proposal to develop over 700 acres in Pemberton Township at the Pole Bridge Forest. We helped preserve a large section of the Pomona Woods in Atlantic County, which is Natural Lands Trust Preserve. And this goes to show the power of the grassroots and people that really care about these places. You can step in and actually get your interests represented if you organize with a large group of people and dedicate yourselves to achieving a common goal. And we've been able to make that happen. There are a few opportunities as well, stuff that we're working on right now. Another victory is the Wharton State Forest map, which it's going to help control some of that off-road vehicle impact out in Wharton. There's an opportunity to designate the Mullica River as a National Wild and Scenic River. That will help layer on protection. So while we have the National Reserve and we have the State Pinelands Act, given the impending threats, the impending development pressure, I think every legal layer we can put on, the better. And it also gives a certain status for the Mullica, which is really one of the cleanest rivers on the east coast of the United States. In Winslow, we're trying to prevent the depletion of the aquifer there, which is part of the Great Egg Harbor River, which is a National Wild and Scenic River. There is huge development pressure in Camden County and specifically in Winslow right now, where they're approving every development application that's coming through the planning board onto farms, onto any patch of forest they have left. So the Pinelands Commission right now can regulate the pumping of over 50,000 gallons per day. But Winslow and a sand mining company, they're challenging that authority, the authority of the Pinelands Commission to regulate the use of groundwater. So that, if you think about your public rights, you have a right to water. So excessive use of that water is completely against your rights, your interests. So we're trying to protect that in Winslow, but it's going to be a long process. But people are really standing up for it. We also have the chance to expand the Black Run Preserve because there's a 700-acre headwaters area that's still in private ownership. So recently, there was a rule proposal that changed the designation to forest area, but now it still has to be acquired. So we still have to move it from that private ownership to public ownership. So that's something that we're going to be pushing really, really hard pretty soon. And then there's the broader outlook. So New Jersey is the first state facing build out. So you can see we have a ton of acres preserved as open space, and we have a ton of acres developed. And what's left on the table is about 1,400,000 acres that still is up for grabs, essentially. It'll either be developed or it'll be open space. And we want to get as much of that as possible. That's the goal. That'll help protect our natural resources, our groundwater, and it'll also help protect wildlife and of course, the opportunity for exploration. So I'll leave you with that. That's the goal, 50% by 2050. And that's Michelle Byers, who proposed the Nature for All vision for New Jersey. So from there, I can answer any questions you have. So what are your questions?
Yeah, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat and then Jason can see them. Or if you want to talk, you can just click the raise your hand button and I can unmute you. So there's two options there.
So Tara, so what is Wildcat Ridge? I don't know if Tara's still on, but that sounds like a fun place in the chat there. Red. So Jen's saying there was a red map through the DEP that established development space. What is the current view of the DEP now? I don't know. I've not seen that red map, Jen. I'd like to see that. There is a state planning process happening right now where the state plan is being developed. Oh, cool. Yeah, wildlife management up by Farney State Park. It's funny being down here in South Jersey. I don't get up to North Jersey too much. I'll have to go check that out. Okay, so it's hiking trails from the leftover mines. Wow, that sounds fun. Let me ask this: Did I do a decent job of explaining your basic concepts of rights on public land? Like, do you feel like do you feel that you actually have rights of public land? Do you feel that ownership, or do you feel like it's somebody else's? And what I'm trying to get at is if we don't actually feel that sense of ownership, I think we'll be less likely to act when impacts are proposed. So question, do you think it'll be possible for a portion or the whole reserve to become a national park? And what are some of the most important steps? Jonathan, I think it's totally possible for a national park to be developed. Actually, the first proposal for the Pine Barrens was a national monument, which is a somewhat different framework for the National Park Service. But the problem is it a good idea to make a part of the Pine Barrens a national park? And I don't think I have exactly the answer, whether it is or not. I would actually put that out to the public, because while the National Park Service does do a great job on the parks that they have, what you need is an act of Congress to actually establish a national park, unless you go the national monument route. So the national monument could be essentially dedicated by a president of the United States, where a national park has to be designated by Congress. They both have the same protections, but if you have it designated by Congress, it's harder to undo it. So, what they're seeing in Utah, and one group I could really recommend getting in touch with in Utah is the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. But what's happening in Utah is that some of those national monuments are being rolled back right now, and there's pressure to give away the land back to the state. I worry a little bit about going federal because it disconnects some of the local pressures, political pressure, and it makes it more of a federal issue. Now, that may be a good thing in some ways, because we might see in the future with sea level rise that state politicians say, well, hey, look at all this land in the Pine Barrens. Maybe we should, put up a bunch of McMansions over Wharton State Forest. It's certainly possible. So it's a bit of a there's some pros and cons for the national park idea. Definitely could be done. It's just a matter of building a movement for it and deciding whether or not it's actually a good idea for the long term. So Tara, how can we advocate for preservation of public lands? Well, it really depends on where you are. But a great thing to do, and I think is always useful, is getting a group of people together and getting meetings with your elected representatives. So that's maybe your state senator, state assembly people, and talking about your priorities. So in your district, talking about your priorities. You want to see more public land in your district. That's what I would recommend, unless you want to run for office, which let me know if you're doing that, because we need more people that care about open space actually holding levers of power. It's not always enough just to lobby these folks. We need people in there that really care. And, in the 1970s, there was a movement. There was an environmental movement, an open space movement, and we are still benefiting from that movement today. And a lot of the people from that movement got in office. But what's happening now is we're on the end of that generation, and we need new people to get involved that really care about open space. Kyle asks if there's a timber harvest in any part of the Pinelands. On private land, there's a lot of cedar that is harvested, especially in some of the cranberry bog properties. So yeah, there are still a few sawmills operating. Shire Brothers in Egg Harbor City, Medford Cedar, and generally they're working with some of the large private landowners that still have some Atlantic white cedar on their property. And if they do it correctly, cedar can be restored. The main problem is the deer, because if they just clear cut and do nothing else, a lot of times the cedar won't come back if there's a lot of deer pressure, just like in that photograph. Yeah, John, the national park thing I've thought about quite a bit. It's a challenging one. There's definite pros, but there could also be some big costs down the road if it goes sideways. If it's designated by Congress, I could see it lasting, but as a national monument, it could be a little trickier given the current political environment. Yeah, Jen, the 70s, the 60s and the 70s, and what was happening there, rivers were catching on fire. People were seeing, trash wash up on their beaches. People were learning about places like the Love Canal, where schools and whole neighborhoods were built on toxic waste dumps. So there were a lot of what you'd call trigger moments, waking people up at that time, the importance of preserving our environment. So there was a big reason. There's a reason for that movement. And today in New Jersey, we're having more trigger moments where these giant warehouses are being constructed on farmland, on forests, and people are realizing that if we keep allowing development, there isn't going to be much left to enjoy here. So, part of the great thing about living in Jersey is that we have all this open space, and it's going to be our job to protect it. All right.
Thanks,
Well,
Jace.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you all. Oh, Adam Nolan, do you foresee data centers threatening pine barrens in the future? Maybe. We don't have that much energy here, so as far as cheap electricity prices that data centers need, I doesn't seem like we have much of that. So I don't think that's a concern, but never. I wouldn't count it out either necessarily because we have space. So we'll 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 keep an eye out on that one. So I really appreciate everybody spending their time and getting to know some of these topics of public lands, and we really need you to stand up for these places in your community and with your state elected officials.
And just real quick, I'm going to put in the chat where you can take action to sign petitions for the aquifer in Winslow Township and Black Run Preserve. So you can go
Oh,
there and find those petitions.
yeah, especially I think somebody, was it Steven, who said they were in Sicklerville? We're going to need you in Winslow. Absolutely. Please sign that petition about the aquifer in Winslow.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jason. Really appreciate it.
All right.
Have a great day, guys.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Steven. Bye, everybody.